1. Why you care. What people think. Have you ever stopped yourself from doing something simply because of what other people might think? Maybe you stayed quiet when you wanted to speak. Maybe you gave up on a dream because you were afraid of being judged. Or maybe you've spent years trying to become someone just to earn other people's approval. If so, you're not alone. Here's something fascinating. Psychologists have discovered that the human brain is naturally wired to care about other people's opinions. Thousands of years ago, being rejected by your tribe could mean losing protection, resources, and even your chance of survival. In other words, your brain evolved to treat social acceptance as a matter of life and death. The problem is, your brain still reacts that way today. A stranger's opinion, a negative comment, an awkward moment, even the fear of being judged by people you'll never meet again can feel far more important than it really is. And without realizing it, you begin living for approval instead of authenticity. You stay quiet when you should speak. You play it safe when you should take chances. You become the version of yourself that others expect, instead of the person you truly want to be. So why does your brain care so much about what other people think? Why is their approval so powerful? And more importantly, can you finally break free from the need for validation and start living on your own terms? By the end of this video, you'll understand the psychology behind social approval, why your brain fears judgment, and several research-backed strategies that can help you stop seeking validation and build genuine confidence from within. Welcome back to the channel, or if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm a psychologist, and today we're exploring one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior: our need for other people's approval. We'll uncover the neuroscience behind social acceptance, the psychological roots of people-pleasing, a real story from my practice, and practical techniques that can help you stop letting other people's opinions control your decisions. If understanding the hidden mechanics of the human mind is something you care about, make sure you're subscribed, because every week we explore the psychology behind behavior, emotions, relationships, and the invisible forces that shape our everyday lives. Now, let's begin with one simple question. What if the biggest prison you'll ever live in is the fear of what other people think? The most important thing to understand about caring what people think is that it isn't a weakness, it isn't vanity, and it isn't something that only insecure people deal with. It is, at its root, one of the oldest and most deeply wired survival mechanisms in the human brain. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, your survival didn't depend primarily on your individual capabilities. It depended on your membership in a group. Being accepted, included, and valued by the people around you was, quite literally, a matter of life and death. Banishment from a tribe, even temporary social rejection, could mean exposure, starvation, or vulnerability to predators that no single human could survive alone. Your brain learned, over hundreds of thousands of years, to treat social rejection as an existential threat, and to invest enormous attention and energy in tracking, anticipating, and managing other people's perception of you, because that perception was directly tied to your safety and survival. This is why modern brain imaging studies show that social rejection activates many of the same neural regions as physical pain. It's not metaphorical when someone says rejection hurts, neurologically speaking. Something genuinely similar is happening. Your brain doesn't neatly distinguish between the sting of a physical injury and the sting of being excluded, criticized, or disapproved of, because for most of human history, both were genuine threats to your continued existence. The problem, as with so many of these deeply wired systems, is that the world has changed dramatically, while the underlying neurological machinery has stayed almost entirely the same. Today, being mildly criticized by a colleague doesn't threaten your survival in any literal sense, but your amygdala doesn't know that. It responds to social threat with the same alarm it would use for physical danger, flooding your body with cortisol, narrowing your attention, and making the source of that threat feel far larger and more consequential than it actually is. Here's where it gets more specific, because caring what people think isn't one uniform experience. It shows up in several different patterns that each have their own distinct psychological texture. The first and most common is approval seeking, the persistent need to receive validation from others in order to feel okay about yourself. In moderate amounts, this is normal and healthy, Human beings are social creatures, and positive regard from others does genuinely contribute to well-being. The problem emerges when the need for approval becomes the primary driver of decision-making. When you consistently choose what to say, what to do, how to dress, what career to pursue, based primarily on what you calculate will generate the most positive reception from the people around you, rather than on what is actually true, meaningful, or right for you. Over time, this produces a specific kind of quiet emptiness, a life that looks fine from the outside but feels hollow from the inside, because most of it was built to an external audience, rather than to any internal compass. The second pattern is fear of negative evaluation, which is subtly different from approval seeking. This isn't primarily about wanting positive responses, it's specifically about the dread of negative ones. People in this pattern may not particularly need others to praise them. They simply cannot tolerate the thought of being judged, criticised, laughed at, or seen as incompetent or inadequate. This tends to produce a specific behavioural footprint, avoiding anything where failure or judgment is publicly visible. Holding back in conversations, not raising your hand, not starting the project, not making the call, not putting yourself forward, because any of those actions could result in negative evaluation, and the prospect of that evaluation feels, to the nervous system, genuinely dangerous. The third pattern is what psychologists sometimes call social comparison, the habitual tendency to assess your own worth not by any internal standard, but by how you appear relative to other people around you. Am I doing better or worse than them? Do they think I'm as smart, as successful, as capable, as attractive? This pattern is particularly exhausting because it's inherently unstable. There will always be someone to compare unfavourably against, and any reassurance the comparison briefly provides dissolves quickly because the next comparison is already forming. If any of these patterns are resonating with you, go ahead and drop a comment telling me which one you recognise most in yourself: the approval seeker, the fear of negative evaluation, or the chronic comparer. I read through these regularly, and if this video is helping you see your own patterns more clearly, take a second to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this reach more people who might need to hear it. I want to tell you about a patient I worked with. I'll call her Serena. She was 35 years old, a marketing director, articulate, professionally accomplished, the kind of person others frequently described as impressive. And yet she came to me because she had recently turned down what she described as her dream job opportunity, a role she had wanted for years, because, in her words, she couldn't handle what people would say if she failed. When we sat with that more carefully, what emerged was remarkable in its specificity. Serena wasn't primarily afraid of failing the job itself. She was afraid of the version of events where she failed, and people she knew, colleagues, old classmates, distant family members, people she barely spoke to, saw her fail. She could tolerate, at least in theory, private struggle. What she couldn't tolerate was the imagined expressions on other people's faces. As we worked together across several months, we discovered that Serena had grown up the eldest child of parents who placed enormous social value on external presentation, a household where how things looked to the neighbourhood, the extended family, and the community was treated as genuinely paramount. Serena had absorbed very early the belief that her value was inseparable from other people's perception of her, and that belief had been running her major life decisions quietly for decades. The tragedy wasn't just that she'd turned down the opportunity, it was that in the moment, it had felt like the only reasonable choice. What we worked on together was not a program to stop caring what people thought entirely. That would have been both unrealistic and unnecessary. Serena cared about relationships and community for genuinely healthy reasons too, and those were worth preserving. What we worked on was learning to distinguish, in any given moment, between the caring that came from her actual values and the caring that came from that old, inherited terror of being seen as less than acceptable. Those feel completely different once you have a way to tell them apart. So here's what actually helps. The first tool is what I call the source audit. When you notice a strong pull to do or not do something based on what people might think, pause and ask, whose opinion is actually at stake here, and why does it matter to me specifically? Sometimes you'll find it's the opinion of someone whose judgment you genuinely respect and who knows you well, which is legitimate information worth weighing. Far more often you'll find it's a vague, diffuse audience, everyone, people, they, an imagined crowd with no specific faces, and that discovery alone tends to significantly reduce the power of the pull because you've revealed it as a phantom rather than a real consideration. The second tool is values clarification, deliberately and explicitly identifying what you actually care about, independent of anyone else's approval. For many people who've spent years running on external validation, this is harder than it sounds because they've rarely been asked to check in with their own preferences and values without simultaneously running the calculation of how those preferences will land with others. A useful way into this is asking, if I knew with absolute certainty that no one whose opinion I fear would ever find out about this decision, what would I choose? The delta between that answer and what you are actually planning to do reveals how much of your decision is genuinely yours. The third tool is graduated exposure to disapproval, which sounds uncomfortable because it is, but it's one of the most reliably effective ways to genuinely reduce the power that feared judgment holds over you. This means deliberately taking small, low-stakes actions where you risk mild disapproval and then sitting with the discomfort rather than immediately seeking reassurance, allowing your nervous system to learn, through actual lived experience, that the disapproval didn't destroy you. Small things, sharing an unpopular opinion in a low-stakes setting, wearing something you like but worry others won't, saying no to something you don't want to do, and noticing that the feared catastrophe doesn't materialize. Over time, this builds what psychologists sometimes call distress tolerance around social evaluation, a genuine expansion of your capacity to function comfortably even when not everyone approves. A fourth and particularly important tool is distinguishing between feedback and judgment. Not all attention to how others perceive you is avoidance-driven fear. Genuine feedback from people who know you well, who have relevant expertise, and who are invested in your actual well-being is valuable information worth taking seriously. The problem isn't caring what people think in principle, it's the indiscriminate caring, giving equal or greater weight to the imagined opinions of vague acquaintances, strangers, or people with no real stake in your life, than to the considered views of people who actually matter to you. Building that discrimination is one of the most practically useful things you can do. Now, some important cautions worth naming. These tools are genuinely helpful for the everyday social anxiety and approval seeking that most people experience. And for many people, the level of insight in this video alone starts to shift things meaningfully. But if your fear of what people think is severe enough that it's significantly restricting your daily life, preventing you from forming relationships, holding you back from necessary medical, financial, or personal decisions, or leaving you in persistent distress, that's a sign worth bringing directly to a licensed mental health professional, because there may be an underlying social anxiety disorder or related condition that benefits from structured clinical support. And reaching out for that support is one of the bravest things you can do, especially when the fear of judgment makes even seeking help feel risky. So let's bring all of this together. Caring what people think is not a flaw or a weakness. It's an ancient, deeply wired survival mechanism that once kept your ancestors alive by motivating them to stay valuable, accepted, and included in the group they depended on. The problem isn't that this system exists, it's that it can run well past its usefulness, quietly shaping major life decisions based on imagined audiences that barely exist, inherited beliefs about social value that were never yours to begin with, and a neurological alarm system that treats social disapproval with the same urgency it reserves for physical danger. By auditing whose opinion is actually at stake, clarifying what you genuinely value, independent of anyone's approval, gradually exposing yourself to small, survivable disapprovals rather than avoiding them, and learning to distinguish genuine useful feedback from indiscriminate fear-based caring, you take back something genuinely important: the ability to make your own decisions from the inside out, rather than from the outside in. If this video gave you a new way of understanding your own relationship with other people's opinions, I have a follow-up video, right after this one, on exactly how chronic stress physically reshapes the brain over time, and I think you'll find it just as worth your time, so go ahead and click through to that next. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming. And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, take a moment to send it their way. If you're struggling, please don't hesitate to reach out to one. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.